from Czech Republic and Mongolia, studying international relations and entrepreneurial leadership. First, I would like to thank you, our tremendous audience, for your active participation. Considering that we are moving into the 23rd hour of this conference, almost a full day's and night's worth of order and chaos. Our keynote conversation this evening will cover diplomacy and American foreign policy in the context of this turbulent world. The nature of diplomacy is changing. Twitter has at times replaced diplomatic protocol, and shared values that have once transcended pure national interest are now in question. American foreign policy is undefined, and the thought of America's leadership in the free world raises the eyebrows of not only of those on the periphery, but also of those who have historically thrived in it and have been secured by it, including my own country of Czech Republic. So how did we get here? Tonight, we will attempt to seek answers to this question by looking at both the past and present. We will hear from two terrific experts who have practiced, studied, and covered diplomacy and American foreign policy. So it is my honor to introduce Ambassador Nicholas Burns. Ambassador Nicholas Burns is the Roy and Barbara Goodman family Professor of Practice of Diplomacy and International Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He is Director of the Future of Diplomacy Project and Faculty Chair for programs on the Middle East and on India and South Asia. He serves on the Board of Directors of the Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs and Faculty Associate at Harvard's Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. Ambassador Burns served in the United States government for 27 years. He was former Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, the State Department's third-ranking official when he led negotiations on the U.S.-India civil nuclear agreement. He was U.S. Ambassador to NATO from 2001 to 2005, Ambassador to Greece from 1997 to 2001, and worked for 5 years from 1990 to 1995 on the National Security Council in the White House, where he was Senior Director for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia Affairs, and Special Assistant to President Clinton and Director for Soviet Affairs in the administration of President George H.W. Bush. Ambassador Burns has received 12 honorary degrees, the Presidential Distinguished Service Award, the Secretary of State Distinguished Service Award, the Woodrow Wilson Award for Public Service from the Johns Hopkins University, and the Boston College Alumni Achievement Award. Ambassador Burns was a keynote speaker for our 2004 EPIIC Symposium on the Middle East, where he also received the Jean Mayer Global Citizenship Award from Tufts University. So now, I would like to invite my classmate, Maria Ilias, a Pickering Fellow here at Fletcher, to introduce our second distinguished speaker for tonight.
I always have this issue. Good evening, everyone. My name is Maria Ilias. Thank you so much for being here. I'm from the DC area. I'm a first-year master's student here at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. And it was my pleasure to be in the EPIIC course last semester with the very talented undergraduates that you have seen throughout the course of this conference. So I really enjoyed working with all of you. But tonight I'd like to introduce Mr. David Sanger. David Sanger is a native of White Plains, New York, and is the chief Washington correspondent for the New York Times. He has been writing for the Times for 3 decades, covering foreign policy, globalization, nuclear proliferation, and the presidency from New York, Tokyo, and Washington. Soon after joining the Times in 1982, Mr. Sanger began specializing in the confluence of economic and foreign policy. Throughout the 80s and the 90s, he wrote extensively about how issues of national wealth and competitiveness came to redefine the relationships between the United States and its major allies. He was correspondent and then bureau chief of the Tokyo for 6 years, traveling widely in Asia. He wrote some of the first pieces describing North Korea's nuclear weapons program, the rise and fall of Japan as one of the world's economic powerhouses, and China's emerging role. He has been a member of 2 teams that have won the Pulitzer Prize and has been awarded numerous honors for national security and foreign policy coverage. He's also the author of 2 books on U.S. foreign policy. His first book is a New York Times bestseller called The Inheritance: The World Obama Confronts and the Challenges to American Power in 2009, based on his 7 years at the Times White House correspondent covering 2 wars, the confrontations with Iran, North Korea, and other states that are described in Western media as rouge states, and America's efforts to deal with the rise of China. In one review, the book was raved as, at once a secret history of our foreign policy misadventures and lucid explanation of the opportunities they create. The Inheritance is a vital reading for anyone trying to understand the extraordinary challenges that lie ahead. So that means all of you should go get a copy. Mr. Sanger's second book, called Confront and Conceal: Obama's Secret Wars and Surprising Use of American Power, written in 2012, is an account of how Obama has dealt with those challenges, relying on innovative weapons such as UAVs and cyber warfare, the Operation Olympic Games, and reconfigured tools of American power. So, in addition to these accomplishments, I would like to add another feather to Mr. Sanger's already very decorated hat by presenting him with the prestigious Robert and Joanne Benenson Public Diplomacy Award. The Institute of Global Leadership established this award in the aftermath of the Benenson Public Diplomacy's initiative Moving Forward in Iraq. The award was created to recognize public officials, intellectuals, and individuals who have distinguished themselves in their efforts to bring about reconciliation and to redress the inequities in the world. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in recognizing Mr. Sanger for his extraordinary work and service to our country in the field of journalism. So at this time, I'd like to invite Dennis back up to help facilitate the discussion. Enjoy, guys.
So once again, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for taking the time. We'll just jump right into it. So considering the recent elections, turmoil in the Trump administration, and even Ambassador Feldman's pessimistic outlook on the future of diplomacy in the United States in one of our previous panels, are we seeing a decline in the United States' political and diplomatic legitimacy in the world? Who would like to answer it first?
Well, I guess I'll take the first shot. I just want to start by thanking the Benenson family and thanking Tufts for the award. Whoa, that really makes quite a sound, doesn't it? And I appreciate having me here. It's great fun to be here with Nick as well. I have to tell you that when Nick was the undersecretary, I would frequently go into his office, and we'd probably spend about the first 10 or 15 minutes trying to figure out Red Sox pitching before we turned to the question of diplomacy. But we had a great time. We had a great time doing that. I'd also like to thank my wife Cheryl, who's here, and Nick's wife Libby, who's also here. So, and. They put up with an awful lot, starting with us. Let me start by saying I think we're at, needless to say, a rather remarkable juncture in American foreign policy where we have left the world confused. We have left many of our own citizens confused. And if you are a correspondent covering foreign policy and you're moving in and out of the White House and the State Department and so forth, as I do each day, boy, we're really confused. And we're confused in part because you have a president who was elected on a few basic principles. America First, a phrase that he got in some ways actually in all ways from a interview that Maggie Haberman and I did with him last March, where at the end of about an hour and a half of discussing American foreign policy, this was the interview in which he said he would really have no problem if Japan and South Korea got the bomb. I said to him, you know, I think your policy sounds to me a little bit like the old America First slogan, expecting him to say something like, oh, no, I'm not Lindbergh, that's not sort of what I have in mind here. But instead, he said, you know, I really kind of like the sound of that. And he proceeded to go use it in a lot of campaign events, as you saw. And he made it a major theme of his inauguration speech. Now, there's nothing wrong with putting national interests first. Nick spent a lot of time talking to me about national interests when he was spokesman for the State Department and undersecretary. By the way, when he was spokesman, because we were flying around so much in the evening with Warren Christopher, we used to refer to his briefings as Nick at night. But the difficulty comes when you come to define America First as America's interests over everyone else's, and regardless of partnerships, alliances, and so forth. And that's what's really alarmed the rest of the world. Not that they don't expect an American president to put America's interests first. Of course they do. What they worry about is that it's a short-term view of American interests, and that the longer-term view is one in which your strength, your force is multiplied by your ability to work with others. And what we've got now is a White House that is quite divided on this point. In one corner, you see Steve Bannon and others around him who are making an argument for basically dismantling the big institutions of the United States, but also the institutions that they feel have bound us in an era of globalization. In other words, that have put global interests ahead of American interests. And then you walk across the hall and you get a group of people who come out of the much more traditional American foreign policy world. James Mattis, the defense secretary, the newly appointed national security advisor, H.R. McMaster, who told his own staff last Thursday at their first meeting that he would walk away from the concept that radical Islamic jihadism or radical ideology had to be grouped together and that our enemy here was Islam. The exact opposite of what his predecessor had said at a similar meeting 3 weeks before. And we're assuming, based on his background, although he hasn't said very much, that the new Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of ExxonMobil, is in fact more of an enthusiast for global alliances, because if he isn't, he's not going to have very much work to do as Secretary of State. That's more Nick's territory than mine. So what we're going to be watching, reporting on, trying to understand over this next year is really an epic struggle inside the administration for the soul of what American foreign policy will be. I'll leave it at that.
Great, and if I could have a follow-up to that, well, in my opinion, I think that media is a big and core component of, again, the legitimacy of the United States in the eyes of the world, right? And so media organizations such as the New York Times, Washington Post, and others get huge international viewership. And so if you do not have proper access and you're not getting facts from the administration, do you think that that is actually working totally against this legitimacy that we're questioning here of the United States and the world?
Well, we are getting the viewership and the readership, and we're getting it since President Trump was elected in far larger numbers than we had it before. I mean, it's been remarkable to see the numbers of new subscriptions to the Times, which have really surged since November 8th. And I'm pleased to say a new initiative that the Times just started a few weeks ago, which is to have people donate subscriptions for students. You may have seen this advertised, which in 3 weeks hit 400,000 digital subscriptions, which was really remarkable. And actually what I'm happiest and about it and proudest of here. The question of delegitimization, though, is a really fascinating one. I don't know any American president who's ever liked their coverage. Lincoln complained about his coverage in the New York Times. He had a general who thought that the best way to go deal with the press was to lock them up in the brig during the Civil War battles if he thought that they were giving them pretty bad reviews. I made the mistake of mentioning this once during the Iraq War to one of our most decorated generals, and he stopped and said, "Why didn't I think of that?" But what's happening now is something a little bit different. In an effort to play to the base, President Trump, repeating lines that he used frequently during the campaign, has tried to portray the press as the opposition, and in a tweet the other day, repeated in a statement yesterday at CPAC, as the enemy of the people. That's a long way from what he told us when he came to lunch at the New York Times and said it was a crown jewel of the United States. So he's having a hard time sort of getting his message straight on this. But I think the danger of taking the enemy of the people line is clear, because it is an effort to try to maintain that only the government or only government leaders under his control can have a monopoly on the accurate description of events. And that's sort of what lies behind the alternative facts line. This thought that somehow or another you can define a set of facts issued out of the White House by, in the old days, press release, in the new days, by a tweet, and argue that that is, in fact, the real story. And that isn't to say that the government does not have a chance to make its case. There's no greater bully pulpit than being in the White House, as TR himself issued. But to try to delegitimize other voices is, I think, a quite dangerous turn, and one that we have to worry about a fair bit.
Ambassador Burns, how do you think this affects the Secretary of State as we move forward into this, post-truth world? Would you be able to comment on that, especially considering the fact that you were a spokesman for the Secretary of State?
Well, thank you very much. And first, I want to say thank you to Tufts for the invitation. Thanks to all the students here. I see a lot of students in uniform. Thank you for your service, for what you're doing now and what you're about to do when you graduate from the service academies. And I just want to say it's a pleasure to be with my very good friend David. We've known each other for 30 years. We're close friends. I have great respect for him. There's no question that David's one of the top journalists in the world. He writes for the most influential paper. He's courageous. He's well-informed. He believes in fact. He believes what Daniel Patrick Moynihan said, that everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but they're not entitled to their own facts. That's what Senator Moynihan said, which is something to remember in our debate about alternative facts and fake news. I have this to say, to answer your question, Dennis. You asked about power and legitimacy to David, and I want to answer that question. If you don't like the question that someone asks you, you just answer the question that you'd wish they'd asked.
They teach this in State Department spokesman school, don't they?
We're all here to learn, so thank you.
So, without sounding arrogant to the non-Americans here, there is no question on an objective basis that the United States is not fading, not as a world power. By any metric that you care to judge power, military power, political power, economic power, soft power, the United States is unassailably the most powerful country in the world, and I think objectively will be for the next 30 or 40 years. China's not going to approach the United States in military or political power. China's economy doesn't have the 21st century advantages that we do. Take a walk down to Kendall Square, biotechnology, Cambridge, nanotechnology, advanced engineering. We have a great economy, a great military, and we're politically influential. I start there. But legitimacy is the question. A great power, a top power in the world, has to have credibility with other countries. And I worry that the Trump administration is off to a very rough start, and I say this not in an overtly partisan way. I worked for 3 Republican presidents, as David mentioned. But President Trump has big challenges in the Oval Office. A weakening Europe. If you think about Brexit, and Britain's out in 2 years, Greek debt crisis returning, the migrant refugee issue has divided Europe east from west, overwhelmed some of the countries to take them in and assimilate them. It's also spurred the neo-populist parties, the far-right populist movement of Marine Le Pen, and she could get to the second round of the French elections, and Alternative for Deutschland, and Geert Wilders in Germany, and the fascist government of Viktor Orban in Hungary. That's a real menace to democracy, and Europe hasn't seen this since the 1930s. You also have Putin annexing Crimea, dividing Ukraine at the Donbass, and harassing the Baltic states. So real problems in Europe. In the Middle East, you have 4 failed states: Libya, Yemen, Syria, and Iraq. In Syria, there are 12 million homeless people out of a population of 22.4 million. 12 million homeless out of 22.4 million people. It's the greatest humanitarian crisis since the summer of 1945. And the United States traditionally takes in half of all world refugees in any particular refugee crisis. We've only taken in 12,500 Syrian refugees, and President Trump wants to reduce that to 0. And in Asia, I think particularly for the students here, the big issue for the next 4 or 5 decades will be, can we work with China on climate change, on trafficking of human beings, on drug and crime cartels, on stabilizing the global economy, but can we also, looking at the people, of men and women in uniform, make sure that we're not dominated by China, that the American military predominance since 1945 continues. David served for 6 years, lived for 6 years in Tokyo as the bureau chief for the New York Times. He knows this issue. We'll both be happy to talk about it. So think of this agenda that President Trump has. How's he doing? He's denigrating our alliances. He continues to say that NATO's obsolete. I was in Munich at the security conference last Saturday. Vice President Pence was there, Secretary of Defense Mattis. They both came out and said, we love NATO. We're dedicated to NATO. And I think we all felt reassured for a moment. And then President Trump had a political rally in Melbourne, Florida that evening, and he attacked NATO again. NATO is the great power differential between the United States and Russia. We have allies that believe in us, that fight for us. They all came to our rescue on 9/11, and they're all still in Afghanistan fighting with us. And that's the power differential between the US and Russia. Russia has no allies in the world, and China has no allies. But we have an East Asian alliance system, and we have NATO. President Trump doesn't appear to believe that alliances matter. He is deeply mistaken. He also, as you know, on the issue of refugees and immigration, has instituted a second round of a Muslim ban, which is deeply antithetical to American history, to our values, as to who we are. We don't judge people based on their religion as to whether we allow them into this country or not, or give them a visa, or bring them in as refugees. He has a refugee policy which basically says if you're a Christian refugee, and I'm Christian, you can come in, but if you're a Muslim refugee, you're deeply suspect. That's contrary to the spirit of the United States. And on trade, we're a trading nation. We've always been a trading nation. President Obama left us with the Trans-Pacific Partnership and a free trade agreement with the Europeans, nearly ready, and NAFTA, which has been such a great success. President Trump wants to abolish all three of them. In addition to that, and I'll end on this point, we have a very delicate constitutional system that we've nurtured and we've had to amend over 240 years. The First Amendment gives David the right to print what David believes to be the truth in the pages of the New York Times. And we now have an American president, I've never seen this in my lifetime, who is now saying, as David says, who has now said in 2 successive tweets that the press, the American press, is the enemy of the American people. That is anti-democratic to say that. It's deeply irresponsible to say that. And at the same time, he attacks the judiciary, didn't like a judge's decision on the Muslim ban, very distinguished judge. He said the so-called judge. And he repeatedly has attacked the intelligence community. Because an intelligence report came in, according to the New York Times, in the last 48 hours saying they didn't believe that terrorism emanated from these 7 countries subject to the Muslim ban. And to disavow that report, they attacked the intelligence community. We have never seen an administration so divisive and frankly so fearful. And if you think about our history, the Revolution, the Southern Rebellion against the Union during the Civil War, the rebellion of the South, and Lincoln's triumph, and think about the Second World War, we have faced much greater problems than President Trump and we are facing today, and yet he acts as if we need to suspend dignity in civil discourse in the service of his own administration. It's deeply disappointing. I hope he can recover from this. I want him to succeed. We're all patriotic here. We want our country to succeed. But I'm deeply worried about the direction that he's taking us in.
So now I'll have one more question, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. I'm sure everyone in the audience has a lot of questions. So I'm going to preface this with a quote from Henry Kissinger from Diplomacy that was written in 1994. So to quote, "Russo-American relations desperately need a serious dialogue on foreign policy issues. It does Russia no favor to be treated as immune from normal considerations of foreign policy. For this will have the practical result of forcing it to pay a heavier price later on if it is lured into courses of action from which there is no retreat." So my question is, have we moved anywhere from what Henry Kissinger described with regards to Russia-U.S. relations?
Well, I think we've moved significantly backward since Kissinger wrote that in 1994. And think about what we were discussing in 94. So the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. It was 1991 before the Soviet Union dissolved. And we then engaged in a great experiment, which Nick was deeply involved in, to see if we could go integrate Russia with all of Europe and ultimately find a different purpose for NATO. And remember, this was a period of time when NATO was focused in what it delicately called out-of-area operations. Obviously, its activity in the Balkans, then after 9/11 in Afghanistan. These were all efforts to show that the alliance could be reconfigured and that at moments it could cooperate deeply. Along the way, we made some decisions that the Russians interpreted as ultimately deeply antithetical to their ability to be a respected power around the world. The expansion of NATO, expanding by bringing in former Soviet states, was initially accepted by the Russian leadership, but later on Putin came to call it the greatest geopolitical mistake, or he called the breakup of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical mistake. And I think what you have seen in recent times is his effort to try to undo that. Not that he thinks those states are ever coming back into the orbit of the Soviet, of what used to be the Soviet Union, but that Russia had to define itself in opposition to the West rather than define itself as a participant in the Western experience. And that's why I say we're in much worse shape today than we were in 1994. We contributed, I think we made some mistakes along the way, but I think if you're doing a scorecard, it was Putin himself who pushed the country far more to the position it's in today. And while we worried before about what kind of institutions we had in Russia, what we worry about today is that it has become basically the instrument of one man. You lay on top of that the remarkable experience of Russia's effort to go influence the 2016 election, which to my mind was a step that we had a failure of imagination. We failed to see this coming. We had seen, of course, what the Russians were doing in Europe. We had seen what they did in the Baltics. We knew that they were combining cyber, something I spend a lot of time trying to understand and write a bit about, with old-fashioned information operations. But our failure of imagination was understanding that it would happen here, that they would take this across the Atlantic and actually try to use these same techniques to delegitimize the American electoral process. And in the end, that's what this was about. And if you don't believe that we were incredibly unprepared for it, I'd send you back to take a look at a story that we did in late December, which was called The Perfect Weapon. It's a 7,000-word examination of how this hack unfolded. Or look at the New Yorker this week, where David Remnick and two of his colleagues have examined the same question in light of Russian history. And I think there are sort of three big lessons from that. The first is we've been kidding ourselves about where Putin plans to take this. His decision to take it here was in many ways, I think, a significant game changer, and one that President Obama underreacted to for fear of what the escalation of that would be and what escalatory elements we could have, and for fear of looking like he was siding with Secretary Clinton in the election too dramatically. I think the second big lesson out of this is the discovery that cyber has given a failing power or a declining power like Russia enormous new capability, much as it has done as well for North Korea, Iran, and so many others. It gives them a reach that they last got when the airplane was invented, to go beyond their borders, but to do it in a way that is just below the level at which we would be tempted with an armed response. And the third thing we learned was that we are really without right now a capability of having a dialogue with the Russians on the things that matter the most. And my bet is that President Trump is in no position to have that dialogue, because all the accusations, whether you believe the worst of them or not, about his connections with Russia have basically put every decision he makes from this point forward under such a microscope that I don't think he's got very much diplomatic room to go negotiate with the Russians at this point. And Nick would be better prepared than I am to talk about how he'd get out of that situation. But right now, I suspect that we're probably headed off on a much worse path with the Russians rather than the better path that President Trump talked about.
Ambassador Burns, if you could just react to the question and Mr. Sanger's statements.
I'd be happy to. I agree with what David has said. I'm going to be very brief and just say that Russia's a great power. We need to have a relationship with it on Iran, Afghanistan, North Korea, nuclear weapons, terrorism. And I hope that the Trump administration will be able to have an effective channel. It will likely be through Rex Tillerson to Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, perhaps from Secretary Mattis, Secretary of Defense, to Defense Minister Shoigu in Moscow. Those are probably the channels. I agree with David. It's hard to think of Donald Trump having an effective relationship with Putin because of all the allegations made against President Trump for his very weak, myopic stance towards Russia, the strange stance towards Russia. He's criticized, I think by my count now, the president has now gotten into a diplomatic spat with Mexico, Australia, Sweden, France, and Germany. The president said in an interview 4 days before the inauguration he had equal trust in Putin and Angela Merkel. Angela Merkel is the greatest friend the United States has in the world, and the strongest in Europe. And so the president's in a deep hole here. And there's an outright opposition to him in the Republican Party. In the Senate, it was clear to me in Munich last week, David, watching Senator McCain and the other visiting, I think there were 14 members of the Congress, all of whom opposed what the president's trying to do, this bromance, for lack of a better word, with Vladimir Putin. Putin's not a victim. Putin's an aggressor. General Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the current chairman, said in his own confirmation testimony, Russia's the greatest adversary we've had. Mitt Romney said that in 2012. He was reviled. He was right about that. President Putin crossed the brightest red line in international politics. You can't invade someone's country and take the territory and annex it and make it your own. That's what he did 3 years ago this week, in Crimea. Then he put 8,000 troops across the border into the Donbass, the industrial heartland of Ukraine. And because he's a KGB guy, he said, I'm not doing that. I don't have troops across the border. But Russian troops, young men and women, were sending messages to their girlfriends and mothers on Facebook saying, I'm in Ukraine. The Russians are in eastern Ukraine, and they've divided eastern Ukraine. And they've perpetuated a false territorial conflict in Moldova, in Georgia. They've been tough against Armenia and Azerbaijan, preventing them from having trade agreements with the European Union. And they've harassed our NATO allies, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. So Russia's a real threat, and the way to deal with Russia is the way that Angela Merkel wants to deal with him. Keep the sanctions on, the US, EU, Canadian sanctions over Crimea and Ukraine. We've just deployed a battalion of troops into each of the Baltic states and Poland. That's very light, but it's a signal to Putin that here's the line you can't cross. If you do, you'll engage NATO. He is not irrational. He's cynical, he's opportunistic, he's aggressive, but he's rational. And so if you oppose him, either with sanctions or military force on NATO territory, I don't think he's likely to test NATO. So for the life of me, I cannot understand what Donald Trump is trying to do. He may think that somehow his image of what a president does is have a summit meeting with a Russian president. Not the time for summit meetings, time for American strength. So I hope that's what the administration will do.
Great, thank you so much. So now we'll open up to questions, and then we'll get some wonderful answers, of course. So if I could ask, please keep your questions short and concise. And if you could also specify to whom you're addressing the questions to. Thank you. We'll start here.
Okay. So my question is for Ambassador Burns. You spoke about how the U.S. is going to continue to be, the greatest superpower in the world, economic, military, whatever, however you want to measure it. That's which is of course true. But in terms of regional superpowers, we do see China rising and its anti-axis and area denial technology improving. And in terms of at least the first island chain, perhaps even the second, do you think that there's a possibility for a rise in China's regional power, and how does that affect our allies in the region? Thank you.
That's an excellent question.
Oh, sorry. And my name is Orlando Economos. I'm also from Tufts University.
You're a Fletcher student?
No, undergrad and an EPIIC alum.
Very good.
Thank you.
That's a great question. I'm teaching a course on negotiations and diplomacy with 2 other professors at Harvard Business School. We're going to be doing a case study on the South China Sea in about a month. We're going to look at your question. So I would say that there's no question the United States is the strongest power, but it doesn't mean we're not going to be confronted with other strong powers, and China will be the strongest, second largest economy, second strongest military, very proud nation, skillful government, skillful, intelligent, knowledgeable president in Xi Jinping. And under his leadership since 2012, they've been doing something that Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao did not do over the past 30 years. That is push out, assert China's military. They're contesting the sovereignty of 5 claimants to the Spratly and Paracel Islands in the South China Sea, contesting Japanese sovereignty in the East China Sea. And these are very difficult problems for us to confront because in the East China Sea, we have a defense commitment to Japan. That appears to have backed China off a little bit. But in the South China Sea, we don't have any legal claim. We have friends and allies that do. We want to see it adjudicated peacefully, not by military means. And so that's going to be difficult, I think, for the United States to handle. For now, we've been conducting freedom of navigation exercises with American naval vessels going through these clearly international waters. China's wrong legally on its claim. The Permanent Court of Arbitration said that. So we want to make that clear, that these are international waters, not China's lake. But the larger question, and I'll end on this, is I think a generational question, and that is that China's not our enemy. And on issues that really matter to us, I mentioned climate before, we need a good relationship with China. But in the military sphere, we need to keep the American Navy and Air Force in particular very strong. And we're creating these partnerships. There's a triangular military partnership emerging between India, Japan, and the United States to counter, I didn't say contain, but counter, and provide a counterweight to the growing Chinese power in the region so that the democratic countries will not be overrun and intimidated and leveraged by what China's trying to do. I think, and a lot of people think, this is the most important strategic question of the 21st century. How can we live in peace with China and yet not be dominated by China? It's a great question.
Thank you very much.
Daniel.
Hello, I'm Daniel from Peking, US, China. I have a question for Ambassador Burns. And I was in Berlin shortly after.
Please feel free to disagree. We're at a university. Facts matter.
I was in Berlin shortly after the terrorism attack in Berlin, and at that time, all the media, social media, and the internet is all about praying for Berlin, like they used to do after the Paris attack. But I have friends from both Egypt and Pakistan. They told me these attacks, or even worse attacks, happens every day in Middle East countries.
In which countries?
In Middle East countries, like
Middle East, yeah.
Yeah, like Iraq and Syria, with more casualties. So there is an asymmetry on news coverage and global focus, and I think it is hindering a better mutual understanding on each other. So how is it? How significant it is on the course of solving this problem, and how should we change?
It's a very good question. It's very thoughtful. And, you know, I had the same reaction you did. There was a mass casualty attack in Pakistan about 10 days ago, and I think 75 or so people died. And a very large attack yesterday in northern Syria, and another one a couple of days ago in Iraq. And they're not the headlines of the newspapers. And David should talk about this question as well. It's not unusual, obviously, if you have a terrorist attack, as we did here, 3 people killed, 260 wounded in Boston, major news in Boston, in the United States. Not unusual if there's an attack in Berlin that the German newspapers will go to that. But I do think we've got to keep our eye on the Middle East. And just in terms of human decency, this should not be relegated to the back pages of a newspaper. The Times, you know, is different because the Times is an international paper. It covers all the news. But will CNN, Fox, MSNBC, ABC, CBS cover these stories? Probably not. And I think to have a better awareness of global events, our media needs to focus more on international news, but it focuses mainly on domestic news. Times is a big exception. Washington Post is an exception.
I just add briefly to that. There is a casualty fatigue, I think, that you see in the media, as Nick has suggested, about the Middle East. I think it's one of our great weaknesses. because that leads to an absence of empathy about first of all, the suffering that goes on, but secondly, whose responsibility it is to go bring this to an end. And so when you saw this administration turn out a list of uncovered terror attacks, they believed that the New York Times and other major media had not covered. First of all, most of them had been covered. But what I thought was striking from that list were attacks within the Middle East of the kind that Nick referred to, although those two happened after the White House list came out. And this gets to a more central question that I think comes up out of this election and certainly out of the election debate, which is, to what degree is it the responsibility of the United States to step in and try to help bring order to the disorder that is created in part by a civil war within the Muslim world? And clearly, most Americans believe, after years of having hundreds of thousands of troops in Iraq, Afghanistan, and then the debate over Syria, that this is not our problem and not necessarily something that we can improve even if we had a large presence there. But I'm not sure that that means that we can abdicate any responsibility for it.
Thank you.
Sultan, please.
Hello, my name is Zoltan Feher. I'm a diplomat from Hungary, currently pursuing my PhD here at the Fletcher School, and I'm a former student of Ambassador Burns. Great to see you here, Professor. My question concerns the so-called strategic triangle between the U.S., Russia, and China. You've touched upon both the U.S.'s relationship with Russia and the U.S.'s relationship with China. 45 years ago, President Nixon took the unprecedented step of visiting China and thereby dividing the two then communist major powers, the Soviet Union and China, and got China on the U.S.'s side. Where do you see the so-called strategic triangle develop? And do you see any possibility, especially in light of your remarks and in light of what we've seen in the past month, that one of the reasons why President Trump wanted to have a more amicable relationship with Russia is because he sees China as the major adversary and a major rival to the United States and wants to get Russia on our side or on the U.S.'s side in order to once again reconfigure the strategic triangle.
It's Zoltan, good to see you. I'm glad you're in the PhD program here at Tufts.
You had something to do with that.
Well,
you wrote my recommendation.
Very happy that you're here. Very happy that you're here. What I liked about the question is that if we're trying to discern, is there a coherent strategy here that President Trump is following? And I think you've put your finger on it. He seems to believe that if he can befriend Putin, the two of them can be a point of leverage against China. I don't think that's going to work. Chinese are very sophisticated. The Russians have a great interest, natural gas, defense, and being closer to China. And I actually think the administration's got it backwards. They've created a crisis with China, and they're trying to mollify Russia, and it should be the reverse. In Europe, there's a consensus among the strong countries that we ought to be sanctioning Russia over Crimea and trying to contain Putin in Eastern Europe until Putin, president for life, disappears with his Soviet-era generation 10 or 15 or 20 years from now. You can't contain China. We have a symbiotic economic relationship with the second biggest economy in the world and a very delicate military political relationship in Asia. So I think I wouldn't have taken the phone call or advised him to take the phone call from the Taiwanese president. I wouldn't have questioned the one China policy that President Nixon enunciated 45 years ago this month in his trip to Beijing. There is one China in the world. It's a considerable government with a lot of pride, and I think the president has set himself back in doing so. So contain Putin, and then try to work this delicate relationship with the Chinese. And I think that would be a more successful strategy for this administration. We'll see what happens now that you do have all the cabinet appointed, and you have in McMaster and Mattis and Tillerson at least seemingly three pragmatic, more traditional people.
And Wilbur Ross, the
the
Commerce Secretary, who's, spent a lot of time with the Chinese.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I would agree with Nick that the idea that you're going to somehow counter China by an alliance with an economically declining state like Russia just doesn't strike me as something that's got very much opportunity for success. It is interesting that there's a model in the Obama years, and I'm not saying that the Obama second term was a great moment for American foreign policy, but they did manage to get the Russians and the Chinese on the same side of the Iran deal, and did manage to work with the Chinese, in fact, got the Chinese to sort of take the lead on the environmental issues. And let's face it, if we leave a vacuum in the Pacific, the Chinese not only are going to fill it, they are already filling it. We've already seen the Philippines begin to develop a relationship with China that is quite different from what the traditional relationship has been, and reject the United States. And you're going to see other states having to decide between a very powerful Chinese neighbor and the United States.
Thank
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Midshipman David Larkin from the Naval Academy. My question is for Ambassador Burns. You talked about the challenge that America has with legitimacy. How do you expect officials within the United States government to address the issue of legitimacy, perhaps going around the president, subverting the president, in the future during the next 4 years?
Well, President Trump obviously won the elections. He's a legitimate president. We have to honor that result. I was on the other side. I campaigned for Secretary Clinton, but I want President Trump to succeed. And I think that David framed this correctly in his opening remarks. There's a battle for the future of this administration between this far-right faction led by Mr. Bannon, you all saw him on television this week, with radical ideas, I think destructive ideas, about American power in the world. And then you have the more traditional appointees, the three generals. I think Rex Tillerson would fit into that group, and you have the career military, and you're part of that, and career foreign service. And I think the job of the career military and foreign service is to be loyal to the president, obviously, be loyal to your oath of office, but give him and give his senior officials the benefit of your wisdom and speak truth to power. General McMaster, the new national security advisor, wrote a very famous book about Vietnam in the 1980s, basically saying that our military did not, and our civilians did not speak truth to power to JFK and Lyndon Johnson as we built up in Vietnam. So it'll be interesting to watch whether we see that. But you have two radically opposing views in this administration, and there's going to be a fight for the soul of the administration, and I have to hope that Donald Trump's a smart guy. He wouldn't be president had he not just defeated the Bush and Clinton dynasties in 2016. If he wants to be successful, I think he needs to embrace the traditional Republican conservatism in foreign policy. John McCain, Lindsey Graham, and people like McMaster and Tillerson and Mattis. But for the career people, your job is to serve, and serve faithfully and loyally, and do your best and give your best advice. Thank you.
Hi, my name is George Filatov. I'm from Russian delegation from RANEPA institution, Russian Presidential Academy of Public Service. First of all, thank you very much for your lecture and for your speech, for your answer on Dennis' questions. Very interesting point of view. So you said that it is impossible, we can't intervene in other countries. And I totally agree with you. That's correct point of view, but maybe there are some exceptions. For example, well, there is Serbia, but well, there were a terrible genocide against Kosovo, so it's approvable. But well, then there was Iraq, where there was terrible weapon of mass destruction. The evidence were presented in the United Nations Council. But, well, something there disappeared, and, well, we don't know whether this weapon of mass destruction existed or no. So, well, returning to my question, which I would like to address to Mr. Burns. So, could you tell me, what are the conditions to intervene in countries? or exist any conditions to do this? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and welcome to the United States. Thank you. It's a good question. It's a fair question. So if you look at the last 25 years, it'll be a brief answer. We can have a whole course designed around your question. It's a good question. There have been a lot of interventions with UN Security Council approval. So the intervention in Afghanistan after 9/11 was with UN Security Council approval. The intervention in Libya in 2011, Security Council approval. There have been other times when the democratic countries, Europe, Canada, and the United States, have seen the threat of genocide, and one was Kosovo in 1999 when Russia's ally, Serbia, tried to annihilate 1 million Muslims in Kosovo, and thank goodness NATO went in and prevented that from happening. Thank goodness we went in. And thank goodness we went into Bosnia in September 95 and stopped a war that had killed 250,000 people. I happen to think, I honor our military, but as a civilian, I was ambassador to NATO, we went into Iraq. I supported the war, and I now regret it. I think we were mistaken to go into Iraq, but I honor the people who served there. What the United States has not done when we've succeeded and when we've failed, and we do fail from time to time, but we more normally succeed most of the time. When we fail, we leave the country as we did Iraq. We only returned when the government invited us back in when the Islamic State appeared in 2014. We have never done in Europe or the Middle East what your government has done, and that's steal someone else's territory, annex it illegally in contravention of the United Nations Charter, and then just not pay attention to international public opinion. That's the difference between our democratic country and your authoritarian leader. Thank you. Yeah.
All right, so we're running out of time. So what I'm going to ask is please state your question. Please keep it short. We're going to have everyone state their questions, and then we'll address them. Okay?
Thank you. Mr. Sanger, what was the nature of the balance that President Obama struck between, on the one hand, national security and self-preservation, and on the other hand, moral and universal issues?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the last part?
Yeah, on the one hand, national security, on the other hand, moral and considerations.
Hi, this is Kei from Seoul National University, South Korea, and I want to ask what we have to prepare for the worst Trump on the point of the Far East U.S. alliance. So you guys are defining Trump as a problem. So on the for problem, we have to let everybody know it is wrong, and the next part is we have to prepare for it. So if we assume a worst Trump for the foreign policy, so what should we prepare for the actions? It would be better if you say like specific, or yeah. Thank you.
Good evening, gentlemen. Midshipman Second Class Sherbanen from the United States Naval Academy. My question is to Ambassador Burns. In the United States, we turn over power every 4, at most 8 years. And so we have yet to be able to develop a cohesive long-term grant strategy. How can we develop a grant strategy when we have no institutional memory?
Daniel Lewis, a freshman member of the EPIIC class of 2017. And my question is also for Ambassador Burns. And from the perspective of a career diplomat, is there a sense of diplomats sort of reaching their back channels and trying to assuage all of their allies and let them know that everything's okay, even though from the top level, everything seems like it's falling apart?
Thanks for all these easy questions.
Hi, I'm Mari again. My question's for Mr. Sanger. I used to write for the school newspaper, both in high school and college, so I have tremendous respect for journalists. To the extent that Mr. Trump is threatening the fourth branch of our government, how would you respond to some of the recent news about his ban on letting New York Times and CNN reporters into the White House Correspondents, given that you were a New York Times correspondent?
Hi, my name is Dimitri from Russia, from GIMO. My question is addressed to Mr. Sanger. As in the US, in Russia, we study a lot of IR theory if we do international affairs. And so to me, it is obvious that there exists a security dilemma between the United States, NATO, and Russia, where countries react to perceived aggression and retaliate, and so the spiral goes on and on. It's a vicious circle. So my question is, how do we get out of it? What do both sides need to do to get out of it? Thank you.
Those were all easy. We ought to be able to do those in 30 seconds each, don't you think, Nick? Tell you what, I'll take the first two, you take the next two, and then I'll come back with those last. So the first was on the Obama administration, how he balanced national security versus moral considerations. And, you know, I think the test case here, and I suspect the one that will be the hardest for him to describe in his memoirs and hardest to be able to design that carol in the Obama library, will be Syria. Because it wasn't Donald Trump who was the first one to take the position that the United States can't be out here fighting every war post-Iraq. Obama got elected as the president who would get us out of Iraq. And he did that, and following through on a plan that was left for him by President Bush. And he did the surge and then withdrawal from Afghanistan. So then Syria came along, and this very naturally cautious president had to go weigh a obviously huge humanitarian crisis versus reversing course and sending American troops once again into the Middle East. And he looked at the other options, what we did in Libya, where we attacked but didn't put troops on the ground, and he said that certainly didn't work. He looked at what we had accomplished in Iraq after years of fighting and probably $1.5 trillion to $2 trillion, and concluded that had not made a substantial change that you would notice, say, 10 years from now if you went back to visit Iraq. And I think he assumed that, like other leaders who had gone through the Arab Spring, that Assad would be gone, and he miscalculated on that. And each time this issue came back up, the cost of going into Syria just appeared to be higher and higher and higher. And along the way, he set the red line that he famously decided to back away from. This is the hardest kind of problem that an American president can take, and I don't think you can blame Barack Obama for not thinking about it. I'm sure it haunted him every night. But I think in the end, we underperformed. And I think we did less than the world expected us to. Because if we don't take the lead in a humanitarian case like that, I can't think of another power that will. On the second question, the divide between social media as a source of more and more news, we can't fight this. We're not going to go back to a world in which people went home at night, listened to 3 major networks as sort of the voice of God, and were expected to have read the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the LA Times, or the Washington Post. I think it is a great thing that we have so many more voices that can get read and heard these days, that you do not need to own a newspaper, that you do not need to own a printing press. And that's great. I think we underestimated the challenge that would come when we were getting more than opinion out of this, but we were getting news that was not backed up by real reporting, but instead simply by political agendas. And I think the hardest thing to do now is to train a generation that grew up on reading their news on the internet without asking the question, what was the source of this news? To begin to look very hard at what those sources are. We went back and looked at what young readers of the New York Times thought about our reporting coverage. And we had people saying things like, well, I watch Vice News, and these guys, they get out in the field. You see them, they're, out, in the midst of these dangerous situations. Why don't you guys do that? And we're trying to figure out, how do you explain to people we've been doing that since 1851? But the answer was that it's not obvious to people what goes into doing a news report that looks like the New York Times. It's not obvious that it takes hundreds of people deployed around the world, both full-time correspondents, part-time translators, and others, to go into this enormous news-gathering machine. And it's one of the reasons that you're seeing more things in the New York Times now that explain the sort of behind the scenes, the Times insider of how this is done. And I think that until we, and the responsibility is on us, get across to people what it takes to dig down to ground truth, they're not going to differentiate what they read in a Facebook post from what they read on the homepage of the New York Times. Nick, I'll let you go to the next two.
Okay. I'm going to be real brief because I think we're about to get the hook. The next panel is going to take our place. Let me say something positive about President Trump. I think he's done really well in Japan. During the campaign, he suggested that he might distance himself from Japan and South Korea, let them have their own nuclear weapons. Prime Minister Abe has been here twice, and at Mar-a-Lago 2 weekends ago, they had a very fine meeting. They announced some consequential decisions together. President Trump reaffirmed the defense relationship, our support for Japan. I thought it was very well done by President Trump. And so I don't want to paint a picture where he's failing on every issue, because he isn't. I'm deeply concerned. I meant what I said, but I wanted to say something positive. If you're looking for a silver lining, I think he did very well on that. In terms of long-term strategy, this is one of the Naval Academy midshipmen who asked this question. There's a high degree of uniformity in foreign policy. Our differences are not very strong in the United States and compared to domestic policy. And so between Republican and Democratic administrations, and I've served both, not a lot of difference about the grand strategy of the United States. We should have our alliance in Europe. We should be predominant militarily with our allies in Asia. We should keep our military strong. We should lead with diplomacy. Those are all, I think, agreed upon. It's more sophisticated than that. But I think what we're seeing now, and one of the reasons why David and I have reacted the way we've done tonight, is that President Trump is a dramatic departure from the consensus of the last 70 years, from Harry Truman to Barack Obama, every Republican, every Democrat. And I just hope that the more traditional-minded people win the debate. In terms of diplomacy, I think that what our diplomats are trying to do now, they have to be loyal to President Trump and his administration, serve the administration. They are trying to reassure the allies that we're going to be there. My takeaway from Munich last weekend, this is the biggest security conference in the world, is the allies are really worried about us, about what they're hearing and what they're seeing. And so I think Secretary Tillerson has been in Mexico and in Europe the last week trying to reassure allies, we're not leaving you. We're not going to just turn American foreign policy in its head, and that'll be job one. And finally, I'm very pleased that we've had 2 Russian students ask questions. Thank you for being here. Thank you for visiting the United States. Thank you for listening to us, and I'm sure we can learn a lot from the Russian students here. You both asked very good questions, and I hope for peace between our countries in the future.
I'll just very briefly answer Maria's question on the ban of the New York Times yesterday from a gaggle meeting, and it wasn't just the Times, many others were as well. There were moments when I was White House correspondent where I would have paid money to be banned from some of those. But the truer answer here is that nobody's going to control press coverage by trying to say we're going to let this little click in and this little click, keep this little click out, particularly from getting information from a White House briefing, which, with all due respect to my friend Nick, who of course did the State Department briefing that's much more informative, you can go into and out of a White House briefing in Democratic and Republican administrations and actually know less about a subject at the end than you knew when you went in. So I don't think this is a big loss. But I think what is important is that the press not come to view itself the way Steve Bannon described us the other day and the way President Trump does periodically, as the opposition. At the moment that you consider yourself to be the political opposition, you have given away the central core of what we're doing, which is news gathering, presentation, and analysis of the facts. There's a place for opinion. It's back on the op-ed page. It's not in the world in which I live. We're here to explain to you what's happening, even if that's a hard truth. We are here to analyze why it's happening. And if we forget that and let ourselves become the political opposition to President Trump or anyone else, if we view that as our role, then we're lost in the babble of all of the other opinion that is out there. The last question we were asked about the US, NATO, and Russia, how do we get out of this? First, by holding NATO together, not letting it fracture into different pieces, which is exactly what Vladimir Putin is trying to accomplish. Because you're going to get much more with Putin if you approach him with a united front than you will if you approach him with a Europe that is fracturing.
So with all this in mind, thank you so much. And the next panel will start shortly.
Are you on the next panel? I do indeed, thank you.
The next panel will start in 5 minutes. Okay.
Incredible conference,
I'm
as
glad
always.
you could come.
It was amazing.
Great.
Thank you for inviting
Yeah,
me.
of course. We'll be in touch.
Okay.
Okay.
Hi, how are you?